Hello and welcome to today's webinar about budgeting for nonprofits by Philanthropia. I think we'll give it another 2 minutes to have a couple of more people join and then we will get started. Thank you. Hello and welcome again to today's webinar by Philanthropia about budgeting. It's really great to see so many of you joining us because this is a very important topic, and this is a topic that I know is an issue for many of you and many NGOs. Many people have issues or struggle with the budget, so that's why we wanted to take up this topic today. I see you're already using the chat to introduce yourself to each other. You can use the chat for networking, of course, and yeah, just networking with each other. If you have questions for me that you would like me to address in the end, please use the Q&A box, because there's many messages in the chat, it's going to be very difficult for me to find the questions in the end. So for that, please use the Q&A box so that I can find the questions in the end. Yeah, it would be nice to have to know where you're from. Maybe you can yeah, let us know in the chat box, as you already started doing, so that we get an idea of where in the world you're joining from. So yeah, we will have time for questions in the end. You will also get a recording of this webinar so that you can rewatch it or share it with colleagues if needed. And yeah, I think that's about it. Those are the things that you need to know before we get started. So we can jump right in now. So today's topic is budgeting for nonprofits, how to build strong and practical budgets. Because as I said, I know this is an issue for many organizations to write budgets, specifically when you have to submit them with proposals. It's a tricky challenge many times, and I know that many of you struggle with that. My name is Eva Wieners. I'm from Germany, and I've been working in this fundraising field for about 15 years now. Um, I am a geographer by trade, so I did my master's degree in geography and my PhDs in geography as well. I did research on how to make development projects planning more sustainable and more inclusive. So that is kind of my background. And I worked in South America and in Asia for almost 10 years. And that's where I learned fundraising. As many of you, I was in the same situation that as a project manager, I had to fundraise for my own projects. And that's how I kind of navigated into this field. And now I work as a freelancer in this field for almost 15 years. Again, if you have any questions for me, I'd ask you to use the Q&A box. This should be somewhere next to the chat. It's called Q&A box. You can leave your questions there so that I can see them and get back to them in the end. So yeah, let's get started with our content. What is a project budget? Starting with a definition. Well, the project budget basically describes the monetary aspects of the project and explains exactly which areas of how much money should be spent. That is very logical, and you probably already knew that definition. My colleague always says, and I really like that kind of picture of it, that the budget should be a description of your project in numbers. So that when you understand how to read budgets, that you don't even have to read the narrative to understand what your project wants to do, but that just a look at the budget would be enough to be to understand the project and to get an understanding of the activities that you want to do. So you need to be careful, or you need to try to find a way that this is the case, that people can understand your project and what you want to do just by looking at the numbers. So that is the project budget. There's two main sections of the budget usually. You have the income section and you have the expenses section. So in the income side of the budget, that would include all sources of project funding, grants, donations, the value of in-kind gifts, value of volunteer hours, earned income, matching funds, etc. So this is the side where you explain where the money comes from. So usually when you send a proposal within a grant proposal, then usually the difference between your income and your expenses is the money that you're applying for, that you're still searching a matching gift for. And then we have the other side, the expenses side. Expenses or expenditures is how and where that money will be spent. They might be itemized and summarized by category, activity, etc. So we have different forms of organizing budgets, and we will be looking at them in more detail in a moment. So usually in the budget, when we talk about the budget, usually we think about the expenses side. So just looking at what we want to spend money on, how expensive our project is going to be, mm, and what the different types of costs will be. But of course, when we submit a budget within a proposal, it is as important to also include the income side, because the income side, describes where else money comes from, and where if you've applied somewhere else for a grant, that would be included, or if you have any other kind of um, if income, for example, through activities within your project, or through membership fees, or through contributions from participants, etc. All of that would be shown on that side, and that is equally as interesting and often as important as the expenses side, of course, for a donor to understand the structure of how you want to finance your project. Because very few times you would send a budget and ask for 100% of that budget from a donor. Usually it's a mix of stuff you already bring to the table and money you're asking for. When should you develop a budget? It's a very general question. Usually we don't develop a budget just because. And we develop a budget when we write a project proposal or when we write a project plan to get an idea of the cost that will incur and that we need to cover. And yeah, where we are always writing or developing a budget when we need to understand the structure of the project. We recommend that you at least write a budget with the project plan, because you only when you sit down and really design the budget, you will understand the cost for your project. You will understand which tasks will require which contribution, how much the project will actually be. If you've watched our videos about designing the project plan, you will probably have seen that we say having a great project plan is key to be able to do great donor research, because part of donor research is understanding how much money you need. And if you don't write a proper budget, then you don't know what amount you're looking for. And that is hugely going to influence your donor research. So you need to really watch out that you start with preparing the budget as early as possible. I've had experienced many times the case that organizations have an idea for a project and they also have a concept. They approach donors without having finalized the budget, and then they ask for very wrong amounts of money. It happened to me as well in my past, that sometimes we work with guesstimates. So we thought, okay, this will be more or less this amount. So then we applied with that, not with a formal proposal, but by talking, entered conversations with this number in mind. And in the end, it became clear that our guesstimate was very wrong. So before you enter any conversation with donors, before you go out, do your research, etc., you should have written a budget and developed a budget so that you have a very clear understanding of the cost that your project will incur and the total budget that you will need. Um, so it's one of the first steps, or the very first steps at the beginning of your entire process, because you need to understand your project, and developing the budget is part of that process. Mm. I think that happens to many organizations, even bigger ones, that they miscalculate by a lot and maybe don't do the proper research on what things cost. For me, what I always see as a consultant is when projects approach me for example, training activities or yeah, coaching, they say they got a grant from a foundation, an organization, etc., and they can spend X amount on a daily rate. And often that daily rate is just absolutely not the going rate. And that always tells me, okay, they developed the budget without researching properly. They had no idea what consulting or coaching, etc., or training actually costs when they wrote the budget. So then in the end, that will become a big problem. So start as early as you can so that you have a realistic and good idea um, about yeah, the cost that is actually connected with your project. There's also other uses for budget. So you can, of course, use the budget in your proposal. That's where you will need it. Um, and that's where you will have to submit one. But there's other uses for budgets as well, because it enhances transparency, of course, when you develop budgets and when you are able to share information about the budget for a project. That enhances transparency because people will be able to understand your project. Mm, They will be able to yeah, see where the money goes, how you want to spend it, and that, of course, contributes to transparency. You can make sure that you give value for money because you show exactly what you want to spend money on, what the activities are, and how you kind of value them. You build capacity, and you show capacity at the same time, because a great budget shows, like if you are able to develop a great budget, that shows that you really do know your field, that you do have yeah, expert knowledge, understanding of what you want to do, etc. Um, it shows competitiveness because in the budget, if it's yeah, a realistic budget, and you have lots of knowledge, resources, etc., to bring to the table, it shows that you're competitive, and it shows that you're able to follow guidelines when you develop a great budget, because the donors often I think look at the budget as an indicator for your capacity to later manage the money and manage a project. So when you have a great budget, that also contributes towards you being perceived as a great and respected partner. There's two main ways to organize a project budget, and one is by activity and one is by line item. And which one to use if you have no guidelines, if the donor doesn't tell you which kind of budget they want to see, then you have to you can choose this for yourself, but oftentimes a donor will let you know which kind of budget they want to see. So then you have to submit one or the other. Of course, the more straightforward and logical one would be the budget by activity, as we will see in a moment. Um, and the other one would be by line item, where you kind of aggregate different types of cost, or not different types, same types of costs into one line item. And I think why donors sometimes request a budget by line item is because it shows on the first glance how much of the project you want to spend on personnel, how much of the project you want to spend on goods, on services, maybe on rent, on admin cost, etc. So it really shows on first sight where the money goes. And I think that is why this kind of budget or this type of organizing a budget is interesting for donors, because many have guidelines that say, for example, that you're only allowed to spend a specific percentage on staff cost. So with that kind of budget, you can immediately and at the first glance see if you're actually spending that, or if the percentage varies from that. So we will look at what they look like on the next slides. This is a budget by activity. So the budget, basically the project budget, follows the activities that you want to do in your project one by one. So you have two activities here. It's a very simple example just to show what this would look like. So you have the activity one, which is in this case an annual conference. So they have a project where they want to train probably, or advance knowledge or awareness about something. So they organize a conference, which is activity one, and they want to train volunteers as well. So when you go when you budget by activity, you go through your activities in a logical order, one by one, and think them through. You can try to visualize them and try to see in front of your inner eye all the single activities that you have to do, that you have to follow to fulfill this full activity. So for the conference, you would need a trainer, or someone who leads the conference. For the sessions, you need a venue where this conference can take place. You need transportation for participants so that they can actually join. You will need catering, and you need materials and handouts. So those are the 5 different positions under this activity that this organization has decided that they need to pay for. So then you have the unit. This would be per day or per person, number of units that you will need, unit rate, and then the total cost for this one activity. Activity 2, training volunteers, the same. You need a trainer, you need a venue, you need catering and materials. In this case, no transportation needed, because maybe it will take place where the participants already are, or this is just simply not included. And then you have the cost for this activity. I think it's, when we talk about value for money, and also how to put on which parts to put emphasis on in the budget, I think it is important that when the focus of your narrative is on one activity, the focus in the budget should be on that activity as well. So if your narrative focuses very much on this activity of training volunteers, and your whole proposal is mostly about training volunteers, and the conference is just like a side activity, then this this split up between 2,800 and 410 maybe would not be ideal, because now it looks like the emphasis would be on the conference, because it costs way more. So the activities and the cost for each activity should also somehow reflect the emphasis that you put on those activities in the proposal narrative. It can't always be perfect. Some things are needed but expensive, but then they, I think, need to be additionally explained. But in general, it should reflect what you have written in your proposal. So again, this is relatively straightforward. Um, Now you have the budget by line item, which is the other type of budget that you might have to submit. So here you have to combine all the cost for a specific type of work or a specific type of cost into one line item. So all the trainer costs, the personnel, all the trainers go together. And here, so we it could have been still two lines, but both of the trainer costs would go here. So the total cost for personnel you can see in this project is 520. Services is catering and transportation in this case, lumped together into this one line item, services, and you see the combined cost for that. And then we have other costs in this project, handouts and venues, and that is also combined coming up with this cost. So of course, this budget is more complicated to write because it's much easier to forget something if you don't go through. So even when you have to submit a budget by line item, I'd recommend that you start by designing the budget by activity, and then from that budget, when you have it done, you can move to the line item based one. Because it's much easier to go that way instead of trying to start with the line item based one. It's, in my opinion, it's very easy to forget positions in the budget. That's why I would always do it in a team, have different people give their input. I think we'll have a slide about that as well. But forgetting steps on the way along the way is so much easier in when you start off by the line item one, because you don't logically go through the activities. So it always start with one and then transfer it into the other. So who should write the budget? Yeah, this is the question that many ask us, who should be responsible? And I think there's no simple answer to that because writing a budget is complicated. Like the proposal, you can't do it alone. Even if you have a fundraiser or you are the designated fundraiser, you probably need lots of input from different departments. So it's always a team effort. I think many people have to contribute towards this, and it can't only be one, but you need, yeah, input from different sources, different people, and you cannot do this by yourself. So yeah, who should be included? I think it should definitely be the accountant, because oftentimes the accounting department will have lots of important input. They know, for example, when it gets very complicated and tricky, personnel, if you have to add social security, health insurance, stuff like that, it can get very complicated very quickly. So you should definitely include the accountant. When writing a budget, the proposal writer usually has input because they know which activities they have to include, which activities you want to cover in the project proposal, etc. The fundraiser proposal writer probably sometimes, or probably usually the same person, but sometimes they are even two different departments. Senior management often has input as well about what they want to put emphasis on. The project manager definitely will have input on what to put in the budget, so you should include them. Officer, researcher, the marketing team, all of these people might have something to add to the budget. Not add as a line item, but add as input, as understanding the activities, understanding the processes that need to be covered. And of course, one person should kind of wear the hat and be the responsible person to see this through. So that should, in my opinion, be the fundraiser most of the times, but you probably need input from different sources and you should work with different people to finalize and develop these budgets. Um, then we have some of the different types of costs that can be included in the budget and often are. So I want to talk about those a little bit. What is overhead cost? And that is one of the most common questions that we get. How can we include overhead? How can we include core cost in the budget? Overhead or core or whatever we sometimes call it. Well, overhead often is related a little bit more to personnel, but it's basically the same as core cost. Um, it's the cost that occurs to run an organization that is not directly related to the project implementation. So that would be stuff like, yeah, the accountant's salary. Maybe the accountant is not employed directly into the project you're applying for, um, but you still need the accountant to do the reporting on your project in the end, or um, to just monitor how you spend the money, etc. So an accountant, or also the rent for your offices, the insurances that you might have to pay, maybe salaries for your senior management. They will also be included at least a little bit in the process, and they have salaries, so those salaries need to be paid, but often they are not project stuff, so it's a little bit more difficult to include that. And there's different ways to include overhead costs. Sometimes you could just simply include percentages. So that's something that I see quite often that works very well. That if you know, as you have an accountant and you know reporting on this project is probably going to be tricky, and that accountant will need a specific amount of time to report properly on that grant, you would include, let's say, 20% of the salary of that accountant in your project budget as personnel cost, because you know this accountant will work X days on that project, either for the reporting or for the monitoring, etc. So that is one way. You can do that equally for the senior management. If you know that your CEO or your directors have to work a specific amount of hours for that project, you just add a percentage of their salary. Of course, not their full salary, but a percentage of that salary. Then some donors also allow you to include an overall percentage. So usually it's somewhere between 5 and 15%, where they say you're allowed to include just as a general sum, let's say 10% of the budget you're applying for as overhead. So then within those 10%, you have to cover stuff like rent, insurances, salaries for people who are not directly employed by your project, etc. And yeah, that is basically the two different ways that you can try to include overhead cost or core cost in the budget, even for projects. In general, I think it's a huge problem that many foundations just want to fund projects and focus on just project cost and are not open to covering core cost. There's some foundations that do that differently, and I think there has been a little shift as well in that department, because more and more organizations realize that that it is important, and that you can only sustain an organization and work sustainably and in the long term when you have ways to cover the core cost and to cover the administrative cost, etc. So there's some foundations, and when you do donor research, you should try to specifically focus on those to see if you can find some that can fund or that give unrestricted funding specifically to cover core costs. But there's not that many out there, and it's sometimes difficult to find them, sometimes difficult to identify them. Then we have co-payments, which is also a very important part in the budget that goes into the income section usually. Those are payments that the donor requests from the NGO side. They could be from the applicant organization directly or from project participants, but also from other donors. So it can come from different sides. Oftentimes, you will find a specific percentage that is supposed to come from your side, from your organization side. Um, so often that is 10%, 20%, 30%, something like that, that you have to cover from your NGO side. And yeah, sometimes that could also be grants from other foundations. There are a couple of foundations that specifically offer co-payments. So you can apply, for example, when you apply for a grant with the European Commission, I think in development, I think it's 20%. I'm not 100% sure how much the co-payment is. But then there are foundations that specifically offer that you can apply for this co-payment because they understand and know that it's hard for NGOs to come up with that high of a co-payment. So you can talk to other donors, maybe also institutional donors, foundations, if they can contribute to your co-payments and support you with that. You could also have the co-payment come from your reserves if you have them. If you have money stashed away, saved up in your organizational account, you can use, of course, that money for your co-payment. So if you apply for 8,000 euros and it's 20%, then you have to pay around 2,000 from your side. But again, I also know that for many organizations, they do not have cash resources to go about it this way, to cover the cost this way. So then um, in-kind contribution or voluntary contribution, voluntary work can also play an important role. So, for example, if you are able to contribute without pay to the project, a specific amount of hours by your employees or by project participants, that can also be entered as the monetary value of those hours. So, let's say in your country, here in Germany, I think what you can put is the hourly rate is something like 13 euros. So if we say, okay, one of our project staff will work for 10 hours for free per week, so then we could add to the budget something like 130 euros because that is the monetary value, put in very simple terms. Of course, there's some tax stuff that you have to deduct, etc. But in general, that's how this goes. Or if participants can contribute something in kind, for example, that can also be a solution. When I was working in Nepal in an agroforestry project, whenever we applied, for example, for to build something, we built a lot of toilets in those rural villages, and we always covered the co-payments by the people having contributing materials. So it was stuff like bamboo sticks that were needed for the construction that they could get locally that often were growing on their fields. So it was at no cost for them, but we could enter those materials at market cost into the budget. So if you'd buy a bamboo pole in Kathmandu, you'd pay a couple of hundred rupees for it, and they had them on their field, they could use them. So, but we were able to enter those hundreds of rupees into the budget as co-payment. So that's another way how you can deal with that. But of course, I also understand that especially if the amounts are high, that works when you have a small budget. But if your budget is over 10,000 or even in the hundreds of thousands, that can be very, very tricky and probably cannot be covered in kind contributions. But it could be a small part. Contingency cost is something that you also sometimes can include in the budget, but not always, and not all donors allow that. I've read a lot of times no contingency costs allowed, but usually that would be costs that you expect will occur, but you're not 100% sure. And that could be stuff like accounting for price changes. Because often, as you know, you'd write a proposal and then you have to wait for 6 months until they get back to you, and then they have adjustments, and until you get the money, a year has passed. And then sometimes prices might have changed. And if you can anticipate that, if you see the price of something is soaring, you can ask to include contingency costs to yeah, kind of to be able to adjust for that. Because if you don't, then you might run into issues. Again, as one example from my work in Nepal, after the earthquake, we applied for a couple of projects where we wanted to build stuff. I think one of them was actually that toilet project, and we sent the proposal. Bricks were a specific amount, and we had to wait a couple of months until we got the approval. And by that time, because of the special situation after the earthquake, the price of bricks had doubled because everybody was trying to rebuild. So bricks were super expensive. And then suddenly we just had the budget that they allotted to us, and we could build half of the toilets because of the prices had grown so much. And that was something that could have been anticipated, at least to a degree, because it's of course clear if you have large scale destruction and everybody's rebuilding, then of course bricks will be more expensive in a year or in 6 months. So that would have been a good example where to include contingency cost and where it would have worked. Also, to cover differences in exchange rate, that can also be very important, especially if you work in a country where the currency is highly volatile and where the exchange rate changes quite a lot. Again, from Nepal, this example, we had the same case, and the rupee had fallen drastically between us sending the budget in euros and actually us getting the project. No, it hadn't fallen; it had risen, so we got less rupees for the amount of euros that we got, and because it was a fixed budget in euros, we were able to do just 2/3 of what we planned to do because the money was just simply not enough, and the donor was not flexible on that. So those are cases where I would ask and see if it is possible to include a contingency cost to a degree to be able to cover for those uncertainties. Then we have the budget narrative, which is also a part that can be included. The narrative is a text that accompanies the budget to explain certain types of costs, certain types of the basically certain types of costs in the budget that explains them and that makes sure that the donor can understand. And whenever I think you feel like your budget needs some additional explaining, you should include a budget narrative. Sometimes it is asked for, sometimes the donors ask you for a budget narrative, and then of course you have to include it. But if it's not necessary, but you feel like there's some points that don't explain themselves, that are either more complicated to understand in structure, or something is more expensive than the usual market rate, or less expensive, just anything where you feel like, okay, this might need additional information, that could be a really good point to include a budget narrative. So when should you include it? Yeah, when it needs additional information. I have this one example that made it very clear for me when you need a budget narrative. So I was working that time in Ecuador in a project where we wanted to fund a reforestation project, and for that we needed seeds for a specific palm tree. And the village was in the middle of the jungle, and transportation was happening over the river by boat. And we had so the village was sitting in the middle. There was one village upriver, one village downriver, and the fertilizer we got, I think it was the seeds, I think, were from upriver, and the fertilizer was from downriver. And so, of course, the boat to get the seeds went empty upriver and full downriver. So we needed very little petrol because the empty boats had to drive upstream, which is harder. And when they came back, they were full, but they went with the current. So we didn't need that much petrol. But for the fertilizer, the boats went empty downstream, so easy. And when they had to go back up, they were full. So that we needed much more petrol for that. So in my budget, I included those two positions. Transportation for the seeds was relatively cheap, and transportation for the fertilizer was much more expensive, but the same amount of kilometers. And I didn't include a budget narrative. And then I was lucky, and the donor called me and said, "No, I think we think you made a mistake in the budget. Yeah, that doesn't really add up." And then I was able to explain to them, no, it does make sense because of the fact that, yeah, the boats had to go full upriver in one case, and in the other case, downriver. But I got lucky and I got that call. But if you include those things and don't explain them, donors might assume that you made a mistake, or yeah, that it's not correct what you have written in the budget. And then you might not get chosen because yeah, they attribute that to a mistake instead of to something that makes sense. So in those cases, definitely you should include a budget narrative because it's hard to understand without the budget narrative. Where should it go after the budget? I'd say again, the guidelines tell you where to put it and how to frame it, then that's your guideline. That's what you follow. But if not, it can just go after the proposal. So when they look at the numbers and there's some additional information they need, they'd look at that additional information, and that can help with it. So now we have some final tips for writing a great budget, and I see you've already put some of your a couple of your questions in the Q&A box, so I'll get to those in a moment. But our 10 quick tips to write a great budget are, first of all, don't leave it for last. That's a very common mistake that I keep seeing, where you see that budgets are prepared in a rush, that NGOs yeah, left it for last and then just kind of scrambled together the information. And that's never a good sign, because I think even maybe even more than the proposal, the foundations take the budget as an indicator for how well you are able um, to work and manage a project, because being able to write a good budget is really key um, to being able to manage money as well. So I think they take that as an indicator, and I don't think that's necessarily wrong. The second tip, make sure you have all the correct numbers. Like I said, if you do guesstimates, or if you say, well, this cost that much last year, so we'll put it in here, um, it won't carry you far, because that way you get mistakes in your budget. Check, ask how much things are, check on the internet if you can, or go to the shop to ask how much things are. And if you buy expensive goods, oftentimes you have to collect three what is it called, three offers to compare anyways. So then that's a good start where you could do that. And then you already have collected a couple of offers when you actually get to the implementation of your project. Three is check one format and stick with it. So choose one format basically, especially if more than one person work on the budget. Sometimes we see that, yeah, it looks different. Different fonts are used, different ways of calculation, etc. That makes it very confusing. So make sure that the budget also looks nice, looks coherent, is like one thing that shows what you want to spend your money on, but that it also looks nice and looks coherent, like one document. Check the math, and not only once if possible, because it happens very quickly that a mistake sneaks its way into a budget. I've submitted budgets with mistakes. I got very lucky one time because we had a mistake where we actually applied for more money than we needed, because it was a mistake that made the number bigger and the donor didn't notice. So in that case we got lucky, but that's the exception. Usually donors either notice the mistake and then that counts negatively towards the grading of your proposal, or you apply for less than you need because of the mistake, which then also is a huge problem, because you cannot go back and say, oh, we need more. We made a mistake in our budget calculations. Um, and you will just have huge issues delivering on what you want to um, what you promised in your proposal, if the budget doesn't really isn't correct and doesn't match your activities. Calculate realistically, especially for staff hours, and also for material. Try to really find out what you will need for that project. And again, do not just make a guess. If you want to build something, get a construction company to make the estimates with you. If you want to run a training, then actually ask people who run trainings what is needed, what is the trainer cost, how many preparation days do we need, etc., so that you plan realistically, also not inflated, but to the point, to the actual cost that would incur with it. Make sure you include everything, very basic. I'm uh, I was very well known in my NGO for forgetting the transportation cost in my budgets. That's why we wrote them in a team so that it always was that mistake was caught. I was very good in going through every single thing in the activities, but I don't know why transportation cost escaped me a couple of times. Um, so make sure that you include everything, you don't forget anything. Think about inflation and exchange rates. If allowed, you can include that as contingency cost, or you can at least address that. If you know that in your country the currency is very volatile and has jumped or dropped a couple of times, then make that clear with the donor. Maybe in the proposal already explain that this is something that might happen, that that's a risk, a danger. Mm, in how you would like to address that with your donor. Also explain extraordinary costs. So in that example with the budget narrative, if something is much cheaper, much more expensive than expected, looks weird at first sight, explain it so that the donor doesn't have any questions when they go through your budget. Make budget writing a group activity if you can, to collect the input from different people because they might have different perspectives that can be super helpful. And have someone proofread your budget in the context of your proposal. So not only looking at the numbers, but looking at how coherent the narrative and the budget are, because the budget needs to reflect your proposal narrative. And if you're planning to spend way more money on like a side activity that is not the focus of your proposal narrative, that might also end up being problematic. Yeah, so those are our basic tips. If you want to dive deeper into this topic, we have developed an online course that comes with a template and stuff like that, and much more information. I think the course video is I think it's more than it's around 1.5 hours, much more detailed about all of those single points. It's an online course that you can take in your own time whenever you have the time to do this, and you can watch it as many times as you want. Usually the price for this online course is $120 because it comes with huge value. But today, because you joined us in this webinar, we want to offer it to you at 50% off, so for only $60, which is a steal. We've had many people going through the course that really loved it. So today, I think this is the cheapest rate that we've ever offered it for. So if you were thinking about getting it, then you should jump on this offer now. It's the coupon code budget 2026. So I hope my team, yep, now posted the link to that course in the comments. So if you're interested, you can click the link, and I think that link already comes with the discount. Otherwise, you'd have to put in the coupon code budget 2026, and that will also go out to you with the link by email. But it's yeah, a limited offer, and if you're thinking about it, I'd grab it right now so you can secure this price for you. We also have many other online courses that about proposal writing, some communication issues, management issues for NGOs. You can all find them on philanthropia.org, our website, where you can find all of our other resources as well. We have topics like how to fundraise in humanitarian emergencies, so something very specific, but also more general stuff like how to fundraise when your NGO is brand new, or donor networking, a little bit more general. So if you want to learn more about any of these topics, please visit philanthropia.org and check out our offer. And again, we have another code for a 35% discount on all of the other courses. and that is the coupon code fundraise. So with that code, you can get 35% off of all of the courses that you can find on philanthropia.org, and see if they help and support you. Yeah, and with that, we come to the end of the presentation, and we still have time for questions. And I see there's questions in the Q&A box, so I'll take a look there. And if you have any more questions for the audience, please put them in the Q&A box, so I can see them and go through your questions. So the first question is if there's a general rule across donors on acceptable overspend or underspend rate. I don't think that there's a general rule. I think this is always something, in general, this is something you should try to avoid. Because usually, also underspend is something that a donor doesn't want to see. Because when they give a grant, they want you to spend that money. They don't want you to come back with money you saved or anything, even though that might be our impulse, or we might think that this is something they'd like, but usually they don't, because they have to spend their money. They have to get rid of the money to a degree, and if you come back and say, well, look, we've saved 20% of your money, then they have to figure out a way to give that to someone else or what to do with it. So usually, the general rule, I think, is try to stay exactly within the budget and spend all that money. If you defer more than 10%, I think, around 10%, you have to talk with the donor and ask for permission if that's okay, if you want to spend money for something else. Overspend, I think, is a huge issue. I think very few donors will allow for that. So usually what you have applied for, what you have been allotted, is what you get, and you can't go back to get more in most cases. Underspend, again, I would then try to find something else that you can include and just ask for permission to spend the money on that. And usually donors are happy with that. Then there's a question, how would you recommend we create an organizational budget from scratch? That's a bit of a different topic. Today we were talking about the project budget. For the organizational budget, I think you need to start off with a business plan to exactly understand what you want to do, what the resources are for those steps, for the projects, the programs, the things that you want to do. And then with that information, you can start creating your budget. So you would list out the resources you need for all the things you want to do in your business plan, and then basically start listing out the cost for that. Often that would be personnel, I'm sure, and you'd focus on that. But yeah, that's a little bit of a different topic. We can put that in our pipeline for webinars because I think that would be interesting for many of you, but it should be strictly based on your business plan. And then starting from there to really line out what your core activities are, the things you really want to do, and then move from there. Then there's a question by Ginny, if co-payments can also be materials or time. Yes, definitely. Not always, but if not, then donors will let you know usually in the guidelines if there's if you cannot include, for example, volunteer time or something like that. But usually you can include that. Often there's a percentage. For example, the last project I applied with here in Germany, you were only allowed to, I think it was 10%, to cover 10% of the co-payment by voluntary contribution, by volunteer work. But usually you'll find that information in the guidelines as well. What percentage of the budget should be contingency cost? Contingency usually is small percentage, sometimes 3%. I would say never more than 5. It's lower percentages, because if there's such a high volatility in the field that you want to work in, that you assume that your project budget will be by 30% off, then probably the donor will also say, oh, that's too high of a risk. We don't want to get into that. So usually that is smaller percentages. It is something that you should also check with the donor if they are okay for you to include that. So this is a good question to start your networking because it could be a good door opener. Um, Then there's a question about the narrative. When we apply for a certain with terms of reference and they request financial proposal, does it mean we need to include a narrative budget? No. I mean, it includes, usually that means a budget, not necessarily the narrative, but the I would always include a narrative again if there's any type of cost that needs explanation. So if something is, for example, what was that land cost in Nepal? It's to buy a piece of land is very expensive. And that is something that people, for example, here in Germany, they never assume that. They think because goods are cheap in Nepal, that land is also cheap in Nepal, but land is very expensive. Um, I think I've read one time that in comparison to the income, uh, land cost in cities in Nepal is as high, like in relation to the income of people, as in New York. Um, and that is something specific that I would have to need to explain. If I want to buy a piece of land and I put a very high amount for that in my proposal, then probably donors will say, well, that's strange. Like, that doesn't make any sense if they don't know that fact. So that's a fact that I would add in a narrative. But if everything is self-explanatory and relatively streamlined, then maybe you don't need a narrative. Then maybe you can leave it out. So it always depends on the circumstances. Um, and then when the terms of reference give you a budget not to exceed in euros, should the budget reflect only in euros or in US or in the country currency? Usually, I'd stick to the currency that the donor wants to see. So if it's euros, then euros, no dollars, but also your country currency. So euros and what they the currency of your country. Because then they can see the reference. You also include the exchange rate that you're using for your budget in these specific circumstances, and those two. But you don't have to include euro and US dollars. So if they ask for a budget in US, then use US. If they ask for a budget in euros, then euros, and always plus your current your country currency. Um, Yeah, please use the Q&A box because in the chat it gets very, very crowded. So that's why I said please use the Q&A box for your questions so I can find and see them there. The next question is what portion or percentage do you recommend for M&E or admin cost? Um, M&E and admin, I think I would pull apart because M&E you can always, or you should always be able to include because it's something that donors also want to see. Often I wouldn't put M&E as a percentage, but as a lump sum, because usually you can kind of quantify, at least for the evaluation, how much that would be. So you can kind of quantify it and include that as a line item. An admin cost or core cost, um, it depends. I mean, if I something between 15 and 10%, I'd say. Not because that's realistic, because of it's not. It's usually more, but that is what donors allow. And that's another question, again, that you could directly ask the donors. How high is the percentage that we can include? And again, you want to be networking with donors. You want to connect with them before you send a proposal. So that can be a door opener. That can be a good um, opportunity to connect with them and to interchange with them. Um, So yeah, I think if you don't know, maximum 15%, and otherwise try to find out from the donor. Some are generous and allow 20%, but that's the highest I've seen. And the last question, we also just have a couple of seconds left, but I'll see if I can answer the last question here. Um, Oh, that's an interesting question. How can we kind of budget the money for bribery? For instance, traffic police officers facilitating interviews, doing research, etc. Okay. Um, yeah, that's an issue, and I think I would try to put that into the admin cost or core cost, maybe even not contingency, but try to hide that in the core cost or try to hide that somewhere. I think I think everybody knows that this is happening sometimes, but yeah, you cannot enter it as a line item. But I think I try to put that under admin cost, core cost, and try to cover for this, uh, yeah, kind of money. I think if it's little money, like you say, I would imagine traffic police is not that high of an amount. If you need to account for too much to be able to implement your project, maybe that's a conversation topic with the donor. Because if you believe your project is worthwhile and if the donor does believe so as well, but you say the reality in our country is we need to spend 20% of this sum for bribery or for to pay under the table, then I think I would try to open that conversation with the donor to see how you could account for that. Um, I know that like in the foreign ministry, etc., they do have line items for that, but that is something that you would have to clear with the donor, I think, or try to hide it in the core cost. I don't think contingency would be the best position for that because that's a small amount only, and that's more difficult to include in there, I'd guess. Okay, thank you so much for your questions and for being part of this. I hope this was informative for you, and I hope you were able to take away important steps for you from this. Again, if you want to dive a little bit deeper into the topic, we have the course on budget writing that has much more information and also has a template for a budget with it. And yeah, it's on offer right now for 50% off. And yeah, like I said, I don't think we've ever offered it at that rate before. So yeah, please take advantage of it if you can, and let us know what you think. You will be sent a link to the recording as well, so you can rewatch if you want or share it with your colleagues. And for now, I just want to say thank you again. Thank you very much for being part of this. And I hope to see you in one of our other webinars or maybe in one of our courses where we go much deeper into all these topics. Thank you so much and see you next time.